people, like I've said before, to say no more new residents. We've got 10,000 too many.
In 1988, 4 houses were burnt down by radical Manx nationalists. The properties were being built for new inhabitants, drawn to the Isle of Man by its prospering finance industry. To the nationalists, these homes symbolised an imbalance which was developing on the island, threatening the traditional environment. This month it's been revealed that less than half the population are Manx born. For the first time, the number of immigrants outnumber the natives. The news has confirmed the nationalists' worst fears.
Ginny the witch went over the house to get some sticks to love her mouth. Harpoon-ay, shaw-away.
Yes.
At a children's party celebrating the end of the old Celtic calendar year, the man responsible for the 1988 firebombing campaign plays host. Greg Jocking, along with 2 others, was imprisoned for arson.
Ooh, I hear you all say. This magnificent trophy donated at the very first of these Hopchinay parties way back in 1982.
Now, 2 years after his release, Greg Jocking hopes to win a seat in the Manx Parliament.
We saw the situation which arose in a very short space of time, whereby there was all the devastation that was created by the massive increase of the financial services industry. We felt frustrated. There was no way of expressing our ideas. The Manx Nationalist Party was just about dormant. We felt as though we could either go above ground and take on the might of the Manx government and the financial services industry, or we could go below ground. The feelings that I had then, I still have today, but the situation has changed slightly, and I'd like to put my thoughts and views through legitimate channels now.
Do you regret doing what you did?
Well, I don't think there's an awful lot of point in regretting anything. On the one hand, yes, and the other hand, no. That's the way I felt. That's what I did at the time. From a personal point of view, from a family point of view, I do. But for following my heart, no.
Gays demand equal rights! Gays demand equal rights!
Another controversial figure, ALAN SHEA, is also hoping to be elected. His campaign for gay rights has shaken the island. Homosexuality still carries a life sentence on the Isle of Man. This summer's National Day was marked by the appearance of ALAN SHEA, presenting a petition calling for homosexuality to be legalised. For some, it was an outrageous gesture. They were angry that attention was being focused on a minority of protesters.
I would without question bring back the birch, and I would birch the homosexuals. And I would make them then do hard labour, and if they then committed the offence again, then I would say hard labour for life.
Others were offended by the concentration camp uniform which ALAN SHEA chose to wear.
It was all to do with Germany, all killing gays, lining them all up, so that people knew who they were and what they were. I wore it because one day our government could do exactly the same thing.
Election 91 with Sheila Mackay.
In a radio election debate, the 5 candidates standing in East Douglas meet to discuss the issues. ALAN SHEA, who's from Liverpool, believes the government's record on human rights is shameful.
Mr SHEA knew what the laws were in the Isle of Man before he come here, as did his colleagues, yet they still come here to live.
But doesn't anybody have a right to change?
Of course they have a right to change. And
it's
the
a
Manx
democratic
people
society.
have a right to choose. The Manx people, the majority of the Manx people in the Isle of Man, do not want to change in the law. We have seen in other places throughout the United Kingdom where homosexuality has encouraged the type of things that we don't work. We've seen rent boys, we've seen young boys lured into prostitution. We've also been told that AIDS was the biggest thing as far as homosexuals were concerned. Transmission was through mainly homosexuality.
But let's be honest with you, and I'm glad Sheena said it before, it's a democracy, he's got a right to say it or do it or about everyone. But when the minority tried to tell the majority what to do, that's what I object to. I object to them being called gays, because I always thought gays were something happy in that in the first place, right? But they can call themselves what they want. What I object to is when he goes round and writes in his manifesto and he says he's interested in heritage, and he goes down on our National Day with all his willy wofters from across, poncing about, having kissings and that.
Alan Shea?
It's democracy. There have been demonstrations there before. They've had to have done it. I've done it. I'll do it again.
Well, Gina, can I just come to a point there? Mrs. Cannell raised a very important point.
Can I just let Alan Shea finish, please?
Man, I did not realise I had a term government when I arrived here. I thought it was like going on a day trip to Anglesey.
In Douglas Harbour, friends of passengers await the boat from Liverpool. And other boats come from Scotland, Ireland and Wales. So another boatload of visitors, young and old alike, keyed up to the thought of the pleasures ahead, comes ashore to let it all begin.
East Douglas is traditionally known as the tourism seat. Thousands used to head for the resort every year. The industry provided a quarter of the island's national income. But holding on to the holiday makers proved too difficult. Today, the promenade at Douglas bears little resemblance to the scenes of 40 years ago. Hotels closed as holidaymakers deserted to Spain. Many voters are appalled at its apparent decline. Abandoned by tourists, Douglas turned to finance. Wealthy residents were encouraged to move to the island, attracted by a tax rate of 15%. Banks and financial service industries were impressed by the government's stability and independence. That government is independent of Britain in everything except defence and foreign affairs. It has 24 elected members of the House of Keys representing 15 constituencies. The Keys elect members to the Legislative Council or Upper House, which totals 11. The two bodies meet to form Tynwald, where laws are passed. Although not a member of the EC, the island has links through its relationship with the United Kingdom. That relationship is now in jeopardy over the issue of homosexuality. Tynwald's been told to legalise it in line with Europe, but it's refused. After Christmas, the Sexual Offences Bill goes before Parliament again. If Tynwald still refuses, the British government will impose legislation. This would be the first time this century, threatening the independence of the island and, some believe, setting a dangerous precedent.
The European Convention on Human Rights applies to the Isle of Man and has done since the early 1950s. And because the United Kingdom has responsibility for the Isle of Man in international affairs, it is the responsibility of the United Kingdom to make sure that Manx law complies with the European Convention. And at the present time, following the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, it seems fairly clear that Manx law does not comply with the European Convention.
The irony is that critics of the Manx government's stance believe too much is being put at stake over a sexual offences law which hasn't been enforced since 1967.
The only thing it's supposed to do is stop me from having sex. There's that so-called amnesty that they won't prosecute 21 in private. No, I've been here 9 years next year. I bet in the law every day. Again, no one's going to stop me. Why have a law that's there if we've got this so-called amnesty to make it legal?
Would you say that the law basically is unenforceable?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult to come across certain offences like you're talking about. We would enforce the law as it stands on the statute book and obviously by guidelines set to us by the judiciary of the island.
Manx Radio News headlines with Sheena Mackay. Local bookmakers are giving punters the opportunity to have a flutter on the island's general election. 3 sitting members are the hottest favourites to succeed. David Cretney in South Douglas, Donald Gelling in Maloo and Santon and David Cannon in Michael are all priced at 8 to 1 on. The longest odds are offered on East Douglas candidate Alan Shea at 100 to 1.
Campaigners opposed to change are lobbying hard. This is one of the most controversial issues to face the island's voters. Politicians are concerned about the effect on their support. Dorothy Duggan and her brother Frank describe themselves as Bible-believing Christians. They've organised a petition against any amendment to the legislation.
I can say that quite honestly. Every day for the last 5 years we have prayed that the Sexual Offences Bill would never come through in its in that particular form that was brought before the House of Keys. That homosexual practice wouldn't be legalised. I mean, that is the deep concern of our hearts that this vile act would never be legalised.
I would be ashamed to be Manx if this was made legal. I would. Definitely. Because we have felt that this island has stood for the right against so much opposition and so much criticism. And we would feel very disappointed if the Manx people as a whole didn't stand up and be counted.
But ALAN SHEA believes support for change is growing. He says there have been few hostile reactions to his election manifesto.
One woman phoned me up telling me to go and see a vet. I couldn't understand what she meant by going to see a vet.
Did she explain?
No, she put the phone down. One man sent my manifesto back saying, enclose unsolicited material unacceptable. You know, obviously does not agree to human rights.
What do you say to people who call your views old-fashioned, out of touch, denying people basic human rights?
Well, of course, we would just pray for people like that, because we know that it's that they've got it absolutely wrong, you see, and we don't hate the homosexual, the sodomite, we hate what they are doing, because after all, these are perverted desires. They're lustful desires which lead them in this way.
In the constituency of Rushen, where the Duggans live, the Isle of Man's first Chief Minister hopes to retain his seat. Miles Walker is the equivalent of the British Prime Minister. Leaders are elected by members of the House of Keys.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Walker. Yes, Curry, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Just calling round in advance of my manifesto.
Some believe Mr. Walker is responsible for leading the island into a constitutional crisis. Although he's in favour of legalising homosexuality, he didn't force MHKs to vote collectively for change. Instead, he allowed them a conscience vote. The majority said no. It's a decision he doesn't regret.
It is something that the ministers, as individuals, have expressed very strong views on. And I think it would be wrong for me as Chief Minister to bind them together, in the absence, don't forget, of a party system, to an issue such as that. It is obviously one where there are moral undertones to, and I think it was right that ministers had that vote. Perhaps not the easiest way forward, but I think it was right.
Whoever heard of a government, the Chief Minister telling his minister you can have a constant vote on an issue, such a strong argument with our relationship with the rest of Britain and the world? I believe, at the end of the day, that the government should have either decided one way or the other. Was it for the introduction of amendment to the bill, or was it against? But to turn around and give them a conscience vote and then say to the members of the House of Keys, oh, well, you must vote for this bill, was an absolute political nonsense.
This is Manx Radio's Man in Line, the voice of the people of the Isle of Man.
It's Rolf on line 3. Hello, Rolf.
Hello, David. No one seems to have raised the costs of our elected representation on the island. If we take the numbers we have, representing 70,000 people, it must be a fantastic figure. It must be one of the highest in the world. Now, an MP in the UK would probably represent an electorate of about the same figure.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not into that game of having one MP, certainly not at the moment. This 24 members of the House of Keys is so traditional, you'd never move them from there.
Those 24 members?
Politicians are elected to the House of Keys every 5 years. This time there were 71 contenders. On average, one British MP represents about 70,000 people. That's the island's total population. Yet they're governed by 24 MHKs as well as 20 local authorities. Unlike Britain, MHKs are elected through proportional representation, which gives people a chance to vote for representatives in order of preference. Pressure is building in Britain to adopt a similar system. Tynwald is the oldest government in the world. Most candidates stand as independents. There's only a very small Labour Party, and in this election, the Greens are standing. Manifestos are published just before the election. but policies are only decided after the election. In the absence of political parties, the island is governed by consensus.
The pros are that it's a very democratic, in one sense, and a very stable system. You don't get any radical shifts of direction, which suits the island's image as a tax haven. That's one of the plus points that I'd like to project, is the stability of the system. The cons are that there's no real choice for the voters, between clear policy choices for the voters at election time, in that they're voting for independents who then decide the policy, and the policy evolves after the election.
The ministerial system that was proposed in the life of this government is perhaps one of the successes. I think they are starting to act like a national government. Unfortunately, Miles Walker, although he's a very nice man, is not really a team leader. He certainly hasn't engendered amongst his ministers their confidence to give him support in several crucial areas, and I don't think a ministerial system of government can continue in that way.
I believe that the situation we have where most people are elected as independents stands in good stead. It is the job of the Chief Minister, whoever he or she may be, in fact to bind together a number of those people who've got, if you like, similar views and find a way forward. I believe that the Isle of Man government in the last 5 years could demonstrate to a lot of governments, some of them not very far away from us, in fact, a caring face of government that works.
But what we got to do is get down to making sure we're looking after the people of the Isle of Man, which includes all the people, the elderly, the young. Let's not make the same mistake they've made in Britain and in Europe. Let's make sure we try to hang on to our particular good things, which is looking after people.
Protecting the community is at the forefront of Dominic Delaney's campaign. The man who sees himself as a people's champion is claiming that conversations with constituents have revealed fears about law and order.
It's getting as serious as it is in Britain. The Isle of Man people have watched with horror what's happened in Britain. The breakdown complete as far as we're concerned, and we're not prepared to see it happen over here. If you look at the Isle of Man, the increase in the number of people who are going to prison, it's reached the top of 100. It's equivalent of 100,000 in Britain on population terms. We've had riots in our prison for the silliest of reasons. We recently had a riot where prisoners protested the fact they weren't getting tea 24 hours a day. When we get to the ludicrous situation like that, where prisoners don't seem to see that they're there to be punished for crimes against the society in which they live and they've offended against, there's something wrong.
Alpha 6 Delta uniform, over.
Delta uniform Alpha 6, go ahead.
Manx police say 3/4 of offences are committed through drunkenness. Douglas Promenade, where most of the island's nightclubs are situated, tends to be the scene of frequent trouble.
Each club attracts a different type of person.
Yes, you'll remain
You can get
mobile.
friction when you get one type of person meeting another type of person from either a different age group or a different clothes style or music style or whatever it is. It's then added by the fish and chip come hamburger stalls, which are allowed to stay open till all hours over here because we've no legislation. Unlike the UK, they have legislation to prevent it, we haven't. And they are often flashpoint situations where groups of people are waiting to be served with their hamburgers and chips, and fights start and assaults. And it's all along this area of the promenade in the early hours of the morning.
195.
Some people blame the rise in crime on the demise of corporal punishment. The birch hasn't been used since 1973. Today there are calls for its return.
Some police officers would say it was a great deterrent. I personally am not convinced. Most birching was issued by the courts for offences of violence from one person against another. And my experience of most offences of violence they are spontaneous matters where there is not a particularly lot of intent or pre-thinking about it, if you like, and therefore people don't generally think, I better not assault this person or put this glass in this person's face because I'm going to get birched. It's a spontaneous thing which they wouldn't think about, I don't think.
Can you just describe what used to happen?
Yes, the court would issue the punishment. A police officer, whoever was the handiest person around normally, would be asked would he be willing to carry out the punishment. A doctor would obviously examine the person to make sure that they were physically up to the birching. They'd be leant over the table or something, and then they'd be birched.
You ever short of volunteers?
To carry out the birching. We were never stuck to find anybody to do it. But I don't think it's a job policemen particularly enjoyed doing, just went for the job.
But in reality, levels of crime on the Isle of Man are well below many other parts of the northwest. On average, there are 3 house burglaries a week here. In Manchester, the average is 6 an hour. This stability has attracted the finance sector. Since immigration restrictions were imposed in the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man has been striving to build a reputation as an offshore financial centre. Population growth is geared to young, economically active families. The island's unemployment rate is just 3%. Finance now provides more than a quarter of the island's income, but its presence is opposed by Manx nationalists, who believe the government has abandoned traditional industries. Their message to the financial sector is clear.
Can I just let Phil
The
come over here?
people who attack the finance industry, they never tell you what's in its place. Now, as a result, and Dominic was quite right, when we come into this government, we were lucky. We had a boom from the finance industry. We were enabling all that time to build houses for our young people, build elderly persons complex with the money that we used for that. Our social security benefits were increased, our young people were all helped, our elderly were helped as a result of that financial boom.
Anybody else like to take up this point? How can we broaden the economy?
Some of the people have benefited from it, but I would say all have not benefited from it at all. There are still a very lot of very poor people out there on the streets. Believe you me, there are.
But what else are they going to do if they're not in the finances? And I don't think the finance is going to disappear overnight, because when you read all the literature that's bringing them here, you want a political stability. That's what they're coming for. Taxation. That's another one, and I'm not quite sure what the third one is. But that's why they're not going to disappear overnight. And I can tell you now, if they weren't here and the boom wouldn't have been on, the wages would have been... People forget what it was 5 years ago.
Do you think we'd have been worse off if finance hadn't come?
No way. We'd be bankrupt.
Well, yes. What would we have done if we hadn't had finance?
We'd all be digging spuds and heading again.
It's dawn on the island. In this way, Sally and Robin christen the day before joining their parents at breakfast. I could eat a horse, says Robin. 10 to 1 is not on the menu, says Father, but I can recommend the kippers.
But even the Manx kipper industry, famous throughout the world, has come under pressure from outside influences. The EC has ordered new, more hygienic but expensive methods of smoking the fish. Today, most of the Manx fishing fleet concentrates on shellfish, but levels of productivity in fishing and agriculture have halved over the past 20 years. Farming here, like elsewhere, has suffered from a fall in demand. The drop in cheese prices has hit the industry recently. Manx farmers don't get subsidies from the EC, although the government has agreed to subsidise milk production. These industries were once relied upon to generate income. As their importance has declined, critics say the government should be doing more to help them.
Always we've relied on outside influences. With the money that we've got now, it'd be nice to try and shift the emphasis away from this big growth policy whereby all that is created is jobs. There's no faith within the island. All the decisions are made off the island. That they could shift the faith to within the island, to effectively the other 2/3 that make up the Manx economy.
The collapse of the Isle of Man Savings and Investment Bank fuelled resentment of the finance sector. £42 million were lost when the bank closed in 1982.
It was a Manx licensed bank. The licence was on display inside the bank. And we didn't think anything could go wrong with that bank.
Since then, investors have been fighting for compensation. Despite scathing reports about the government's handling of the matter and allegations of mismanagement and fraud, there's been little recompense. Many victims feel bitter.
9 years on, a lot of people used to fill this house when we used to have meetings here. Some are too sick to come, and some have died without having the benefit of their life savings in a bank. And these were real, honest-to-goodness, true Manx people. They weren't funny companies and funny money. They were decent people.
Critics say the SIB scandal is just one example of the government's tendency to publish reports rather than take action. If this trend continues of what's been described as indecisiveness, some believe consensus government will be replaced by party politics.
I think it's going to happen within the next 10 years or so. I think it has to happen. Partly because of the ministerial system, there's an imbalance of government power within the Parliament now. And there needs to be a more coherent opposition to balance that out. And secondly, people are beginning to realise that at election time, however they vote, they have no direct say in who's going to be Chief Minister, what sort of government they're going to get next time around, and what sort of national policies they're really voting for.
Do you think party politics will eventually evolve on this island?
I hope not. I mean, we have a small parliamentary assembly, and it would seem a shame to me if a large minority of those people, in fact, did nothing but oppose. And we see some examples of that in the United Kingdom. And I have to say, I don't think that's the best use of parliamentary time.
Until there's an alternative introduced to the Isle of Man's consensus style of government, Bernard Moffat believes local unions have an important political role to play on the island.
The role of the trade unions is to effectively, whilst this government sort of lurches around like a rudderless ship, is to effect some influence over it, to act as opposition where there is no opposition, and to champion the cause of those groups of people who are increasingly finding themselves disadvantaged in this society.
The Isle of Man is making every attempt to kick off its old image. Tourism has become more sophisticated, making use of the island's culture and history. Conference trade is being targeted for future growth. Yet with no immigration controls on the island, Manx nationals feel their Viking heritage is in danger of being pillaged by the invading foreigners.
I'm not in favour of immigration controls. I think the way we're going now, we may have to bring them in. I would much prefer to see the problem as it's been solved at the root cause, in that the financial services industry be capped off.
Those who believe the island's dependence on finance is unhealthy will be watching closely what happens in the pending constitutional crisis. There is a fear here that if the British government intervenes over the issue of homosexuality, it may do over other issues. The island's status as a tax haven could be questioned. Voters go to the polls next week. Many believe it's time for the Isle of Man to make one last stand.